Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast bringing guests together to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. From entrepreneurs to vendors, higher education to corporate leaders, we'll uncover their perspective regarding the latest trends and technologies impacting your career or business. Our podcast is made possible by Downing EdTech Consulting, where people and technology connect. Hosted by Cher Downing, an experienced executive spanning a higher education and corporate career with specific focus on the EdTech industry. Dr. Downing is also an international and national presenter, author, and regular media contributor. Now here is your host, EdTech strategist, Dr. Cher Downing.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast where we bring guests to share their expertise and advice on navigating business, education in a technology-driven world. Our goal is to provide you with options for products, services, and knowledge that can help benefit you or your business. I'm Cher Downing, your host, and I want to introduce today's guest, David Lankes. David is here because he is an old colleague of mine and a wonderful friend. I'm excited to announce he's the incoming Virginia and Charles Bowden Professor in Librarianship at the University of Texas at Austin. And we're going to talk today about his background in information science and working with libraries, and also talking a little bit about his book, Forged in War, explores how today's technology and media world is a result of over a century of war and conflict. Welcome, David. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Good to talk to you again, Cher.
Yes, so excited to have you here today. So excited. And I do have to give you a little jab, because I do see that when we asked, what would you like to promote? You said world domination through librarianship.
That's
and I
correct.
love that. So tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of how you've gotten to where you're at. And let's just talk through your glorious world of libraries and technology and teaching and learning.
The short version is I went to college at Syracuse University to become an illustrator, really a comic book artist. And then about sophomore year was in the midst of a lecture with a really great distinguished illustrator who said, someday you'll be able to rip off someone's style well enough that you'll get your first commission, can quit your job at the mall and move out from your parents. And I said, check, please. And this was, because I'm old, this was in the, 1990-ish. And when Apple was making a big push to bring multimedia computing on the campus. And I was working with several professors and working with several departments on creating learning technologies. And back in the days when we were controlling laser discs with HyperCard stacks and things that no one on this will remember. But I started doing demos of a professor by the name of Mike Nyland, who was really interested in how people design interfaces and how they could work. And so I was like the demo person. And when I graduated, he said, so what are you going to do now? To which I said, I have no idea. And he said, you're going to come into our doctoral program. And I said, okay. And the first day in the doctoral, and that was in the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University. And I was assigned an advisor by the name of Mike Eisenberg. And he said, I got this crazy idea. We run this government clearinghouse for educators on education, information technology and education technology. And I have this thing called the internet and email, and we're going to let teachers and ask questions on email and answer them. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Sure, let's figure that out. And we started doing that, and it was kind of interesting. And then University of Minnesota put out the campus-wide information system called Gopher. And so we built a Gopher site.
Oh, yeah.
And then suddenly there was this thing called the World Wide Web. I helped put up one of the first 100 websites of the day. And it just created this, it was just a really amazing time in EdTech in general and academia, as we were looking at the possibilities of the internet before it had exploded larger. This was back in the day before no commercial activity, things of that nature. I mean, it was just a really fascinating time working on all sorts of things, like how do we design interfaces? What kind of information do we put online? How do people find that information online? What policies do we work with? And as I was doing this and playing with the technology and building the technology, the questions that I kept coming up with and that the program kept coming up with, we realized that the people who are also working on these questions were librarians. Librarians were trying to figure out, how do we get material online? What happens with copyright when it gets there? What about privacy? All of these sorts of questions. And so I started looking into those questions and kept pulling me further and further into the world of libraries, because I'm sure I was at the time, like many people are today, think of libraries in a sort of very outdated fashion of their places to borrow materials and books, and their places, and the librarians organize stuff. But what I was finding is that, even if you start with organizing stuff, 4,000 year history in organizing stuff, and we still don't have it right, it's a little bit more complicated than we thought. And that led to studying it, and led to working with it, led to educating, and led to thinking about it. And so I've just been, it's kind of like woke up one day with an interesting research questions, and here I am 25 years later, still working on it. And I graduated, became a professor teaching library and information science, and then at Syracuse. And then 5 years ago, went to the University of South Carolina and was the director of their library and information science program. And now 5 years later, I'm headed off to Texas to really reconnect my work in information science and library science together. And there's a whole sort of interesting dynamic that's going there, but really help rebuild and demonstrate the scholarship that goes on in this field as a professional discipline. I think EdTech gets this a lot too. Are we so applied that there's no theory? What's the scholarship, where we're going? And really build cohorts of people saying, hey, there's some really fascinating questions going on in libraries. How do people find information? Yes, but how do they make sense of it? How do they set priorities? How do we deal in a post-neutrality world? How do we deal with information and misinformation? How do we deal with the public good and the public square? So that's, believe it or not, that's the short version of how I ended up going from wanting to draw comic books to now becoming a longhorn in library science.
I think that's great. And I think also, it really is parallel when you think about comic books and going from very one-dimensional paper products to now suddenly an entire industry, which interestingly enough is much like a librarian in the sense of you have to do research to find out more about individual characters. Otherwise, they're introduced to you at a certain point in the movie, and you maybe aren't really familiar with their history and their background. So I don't think you're as far off as you think you are. But then again, I'm a huge, I'm a Marvel, DC Comics kind of person. So I see the parallels quite quickly. But a couple of things you talked about, really for me, I see libraries are coming back in vogue. And I say that in the sense of, as you said, they've always been there. We know they're there. We know we can go borrow something. It's the only place in the world that you can borrow something because you have your little card and they trust you to bring it back. But we got in a period of time for a while, as you know, where even in academics, we were seeing people relying on things like Wikipedia, Googling, doing internet research because everything was readily available, but we weren't sure about the misinformation. We weren't sure about the accuracy of keeping that information archived properly, historical versus current. And I think, a lot of people we've seen over the years who suddenly get called out, politicians particularly, who get called out that they misquoted something in a paper, or they didn't cite something properly, or they didn't cite it at all. Because we got in that whole, the internet is everything. It's answering everything for us. Now I see people going back and utilizing online libraries because it's a trusted source and things have been really carried through for it. Algorithms are smarter. They can figure out what I want when I only give them one or two keywords as opposed to typing in an entire title of something. So I think the question for you is, are we seeing this just on the academic side, or are we seeing this globally in all the things that we do in terms of them being back in vogue?
So libraries go in and out of different phases, just as any industry does. And they have to change not only with the communities they're serving, but they have to change with their understanding of the community. I like to say, we still have farmers, and farmers have a longer history than librarianship, not by much, but that they're farmers not because they're doing the same thing that someone did 5,000 years ago. They're farmers because they are seeking the same impact and result, which is, food or, produce, et cetera. One of the really interesting change, because over that, my history of it, and it certainly goes longer, but in my history, we've seen libraries go through phases of, are we going to be obsolete, to, oh, this is what we're going to do, to, just trying to find their footing, as every industry is trying to do, find their footing in an internet age, and going through probably all the levels of denial and grief in doing that. But libraries really situated themselves as the credible source, right? That we have the good stuff, that we're the quality brokers. And what has changed in librarianship, and we see very strong parallels to what's going on. And so books and materials and databases and buildings are all great tools, but that's not the end, right? We don't have libraries because we didn't have a place to keep enough books. We have libraries because we wanted to be educated, and we wanted to create places where people could come and learn and escape, but primarily learn, even if it's about themselves and what they want, they enjoy, they want to do. And so what the internet's done is initially was seen as a threat, because what we've seen happen, and this really is more like a 50, 60-year history, is that libraries used to, they're not exactly holding a monopoly, but it was pretty close to holding a monopoly on the public information source. Sure. And what's happened with Google and Microsoft and databases and all this other stuff is not that the proportion or value of libraries has fundamentally shifted, but they are no longer the monopoly. There's so many other sources to connect, and that's forced libraries to come back and readdress what is the business that we're into. And the business that the libraries are in is making communities smarter and helping members of the community find meaning, whether that's a community is an academic community like a college, whether it's a municipal community, whether it's a school community in K-12, et cetera. And that the tools that we understanding how people learn and make meaning changes a lot. For example, libraries used to be still very much in their DNA is thinking institutionally, that a library does something. Even this conversation, right? We're talking about what libraries do. Well,
right.
Libraries are org charts, or they're physical buildings that can exert gravity and shield you from the rain. It's the people in them that makes the difference. And that's the community as well as librarians that are making that difference, right? What shows up on the shelf is a choice a person is making. What services are offered, what hours they're open, what databases they buy, what journals they buy for academics. Those are choices that are made by people. And so now what the field is wrestling with is the fact that all our lovely notions of being unbiased and objective and neutral, and pick the terms you want, are crap. They're wrong. It's the same thing that education technology went through, which was that we used to see the tools that we use as neutral tools. They were objects, right? They were pieces of code. And now what we know is that they're created by people, and therefore they get imbued with a lot of assumptions, internal and biases, et cetera, and that they must be thought about. And so that's what's getting really interesting now is for me, it's not the answer to, well, there's a lot of crap out there. There's a lot of QAnon conspiracies and there's a lot of misinformation. The answer isn't, well, let's go get the good information and shove it at people, because clearly then they'll change their mind, because we know that is not true. I mean, studies show that the more you tell someone they're wrong, the more they'll believe they're right. And so we need to approach things in a much more nuanced and in a different way.
Well, I think, age also has a definite factor in it. I mean, you and I are old enough that we were not influenced by social media because social media didn't exist for the first half of our lives. Cell phones didn't exist. And so it's hard to remember that time when you weren't carrying a phone around constantly. But people now are inundated either through subscriptions where they feel they get their trusted news and information, or through just the media, social media, that is just their favorite actor, their favorite starlet, whoever, who is pushing out information that they're deeming as accurate, or they're deeming as vital. And so it's an interesting time right now, because we have such segregated sections of ages who all deal with this information differently, and both in intake and in output, and then how they're using the library and what that is doing and fitting into what they're looking for.
Right. And ages is, I mean, it's a tough breakdown because the myth of the digital native is out there. The notion that simply because you were born in a given year, you have greater facility with this. But we do know that, I mean, the society that the culture and society that they're in is influenced by this. And so even if it's not a direct connection that they were on social media, they're interacting with people who were. And so it's really an interesting mode because one of the things that librarianship is understanding is that they're quickly moving away from the idea that they can be the quality information people. And the example I always give is if a reporter walks in and asks a librarian for what are great internet resources to look at hate groups online recruiting, right? Places like Stormfront, places like the Ku Klux Klan website, right? There are all these great sites that you can give that will help that reporter go do a great job in reporting that information.
Right.
When a 10-year-old walks up to the desk and is looking for after-school activities, we're not going to hopefully give them the same resources. So the resources haven't changed, but yet in one context, they're good resources, and in another context, they're bad resources. And that's what librarians are really wrestling with right now, which is the contextualization of this. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about these days is the notion of agents of disruption and construction, meaning in many ways, for libraries and for reporters and for professors and for lots of people to do their job, they must be disruptive in the sense of being able to take people's worldviews and break it up, right? To say either because it's a destructive worldview, it's not a socially acceptable worldview, or it's not helping people move forward. And then we can't leave them there. So we need to construct and say, but how do we pull this together? What's the narrative of the community? What's your narrative? What's your goal, career goal or otherwise? And then contextualize what is good, what are good resources for that and for that perspective.
And having something like that would have made a huge difference in dealing with the pandemic last year.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's exactly what happened to us. We didn't have identifiable sources of accurate information. We just got inundated with a lot of information at once. And we had a lot of different disruptors. People, for health reasons, for religious reasons, for whatever reasons, chose to take a side of the pandemic. To mask or not to mask. I saw a sign the other day that said that, and I loved it. But it really was true because you saw people fighting over whether or not, why are you wearing a mask? I don't believe in them, so you shouldn't wear one either. And so, you think about that, that's one obviously global problem, but everything we deal with that comes up new, and every time our society changes and we have influence, there really is that disruption, and how are we dealing with it?
Yeah, and that's where libraries can be mechanisms to help people deal with it, can help people accommodate the changes. Because that's the other, I mean, when I was working on the book, Forged in War, it was one of the things I found fascinating was even the concept of propaganda, that really until the 1920s, 19 teens, propaganda was not only considered not a bad thing, it was considered a duty of organizations. Governments were to put up a vision. Religions were to missions and bring people into a vision. In other words, it was part of developing this narrative. And it was only after World War I when sort of Congress and other people looked at what had happened with propaganda, primarily the British misusing propaganda, that it took on a negative context. And we began thinking about it differently. A lot of what we hold, the narratives that are coming out of nationalism and white nationalism in the US right now about making America great again. Make America great again was a phrase first used by German sympathizers before World War II. And this is not my way of claiming that it was consciously taken because of that, but a lot of that vision was actually developed out of an all-out propaganda and war mechanism put in place in 1918. The national narrative, US exceptionalism, our role in preserving freedom, all of this was very much, and while it certainly had a truth to it for many, was a constructive narrative. And what we're seeing now is that the narrative, writ large, at the national level, at the very least, is broken down. It's broken down because different constituents don't find it true, whether it is an undereducated white man who doesn't find enough economic opportunity, whether it is a faculty member of color who doesn't find acceptance and respect for their level of their type of scholarship. It's hard to gel around this national narrative. And people then look at it and say, well, that's because everyone's, has their own bias on it. No one's objective anymore. And the answer is no, we've always been biased and unobjective. It's just we no longer agree on what that narrative is going to be. And those that did not have a voice before are increasingly gathering a voice to say, wait, I don't buy that. That's not the narrative that works for me anymore. And we're trying to come to terms with it.
Well, and I think you're seeing that, the amount of books being published now is incredible. Part of that is you can do an ebook fairly quickly. You don't have to go through the big publishing houses necessarily anymore. But you're seeing, I think, much more of a niche focus in books because people are concerned about a particular situation or a particular issue that has occurred, or the fact that there is a historical line to it that was never brought up. So it seems like it's a brand new idea. There's an old saying that says no idea is a new idea. And that is really true because somewhere along the line, somebody has thought of it or has done it, but you need the historical perspective to understand where that came from and where we're at now. And I do want to let our listeners know, because I think, when we talk about librarianship, we always think about either the library in your town or city, or we think about the library at school, whether that's K through 12 or that's higher ed. But, a lot of corporations have their own internal libraries for their own historical archives, for the things that they work on and that they do, for the contributions that they make globally. I think, there's also, we're starting to see different types of information resource libraries available even through EdTech startups who are saying, not only are we on the cutting edge of whatever product or application or software that we're pushing out, but we also want to be the historical repository for that. And we want you to understand where we came from and where we intend to go. Richard Branson is a great example of that, keeping all of the information of anything that Virgin's ever done, even down to his doodles on napkins that he will tell you were complete failure ideas. But he has kept those so that you understand how many failures took to bring a piece of success to it. So I just want to remind everyone that when we talk about these things, we often tend to be very siloed in our thought process. But, librarianship is crossing all of the different types of urban and corporate situations from small to large. And so there's a lot of opportunities in this field, I think, right now. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. I mean, three quick stories around the business. The first is that Nike actually has a shoe librarian, which is a really cool idea. The second is that the British Library, which is the National Library of the UK, decided that they were going to support entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs. They didn't do it by buying a bunch of databases and books on business plans. They did it by taking their librarians, sending them for business planning certification. They redid this space to get rid of the stacks and create meeting rooms and places where they would have regular get-togethers. They built a network of entrepreneurs to come in to build mentors. And so the library was doing what they were doing, which is helping people get empowered and learn about small business and starting up business through information. It's just the information wasn't contained in books. It's contained in people in the community. But to me, the clearest example, because you're absolutely right, library is a strong brand, and it's a very positive brand as well. I mean, it's one of the best brands in the world. And even though it might be, some people might hold it as books and some people might have an outdated notion, a lot of people think about libraries through the eyes of their 10-year-old self. And so, which is the problematic, is one, it's probably 20 years out of date and you were a 10-year-old when you came up with it, but it's still a positive feeling about it. The story that I like to tell, which to me demonstrates sort of the power of what libraries can do, and it's a personal story. But so in 2013, I was diagnosed with cancer. And the way the diagnosis worked is a medical fellow walked in and said, "We think you have cancer." It was a Friday afternoon at 4. I remember this and we need to get a bone marrow biopsy sample sent to the lab, which closes in an hour. So I'm going to kick your wife out of the room, have you lie face down on the bed, and I'm going to stick the steel pin into your butt. And that was about the level of detail given at that point. And, sort of a little personal shocking for a moment, but
sure.
If I had been 3 floors above me and considerably younger in the children's hospital, The way that would have worked is that the doctor, nurse, and librarian, the medical librarian for the children's hospital, would have gotten together, gone over the diagnosis and what was going to be talked about. The doctor and nurse would go in, talk with the child and the parents, ask if there are any medical questions, talk a little bit about the treatment option. And the minute that the doctor walked out, the librarian would walk in with an iPad. That iPad would have an IP address that was not the same as the hospital's, because what the librarian would do is they would sit with the parents, they would do a Google search on all the keywords that the doctor just mentioned, and they would go through the first 10 results and they would say, all right, this one's an ad, this one comes from a credible source, this one's problematic because what they knew was going to happen is the minute the doctor left, the parents were going to do this.
Yep.
And instead of just seeing, crystal therapies and juicing to treat cancer, they wanted to follow up on continue the medical treatment, including the information treatment that was going on. And then what would happen, and the reason that the librarian had a different IP address than the hospital is because they didn't want to skew the results, because Google skews it to a hospital's IP address. And
exactly.
Then as the child went through treatment, the librarian would be there not only to help them with their schoolwork, because they would usually be continuing classes, get them reading materials and Game Boys, they had Xboxes, which really pissed me off. We didn't have them in my room, and continue working with the parents on different things. And so that's what librarianship is about, whether it's in a medical context or you're walking in and saying, I just lost my job. What do I do now? Here's how to do a resume, or here's how to submit a resume, or et cetera. It all turns into the same proactive and participatory view that, frankly, increasingly, the building is not the place where it happens.
Right. And it is a great story on so many levels, because you think about, for all of us, and we're all guilty of it, as soon as something's wrong, we Google or we go to what we perceive to be the most recommended site. So you always hear people say, well, I went to WebMD. And I read, it could be, I could have 6 things wrong
That's
with
right.
me. It could be, 6 total opposite things. For me, I go to Mayo Clinic's site because they have a library. Mm-hmm. And you can look up everything on Mayo's site. It's fabulous. It's fascinating. If you have someone in your family that's a patient, you get even more access to that information. But they know enough about our habits. They know what we're going to do. Those parents are going to walk out and sit in the car in the parking lot for an hour Googling. They're not even going to leave. Maybe they don't even get to the car. Maybe they're downstairs. But we feel this need for immediacy, and we want that information. So we do have to react immediately, or people start to go down the wrong path way faster than we can catch up to them.
And what we're having to realize is that the wrong path is not that definition is not as clear as we'd like to think it is. So the big thing we throw this under is information literacy, the notion of being people. And literacy to me means that you can see a stream of data, identify patterns within it, and then hopefully take advantage of those patterns to some sort of personal benefit, whether that's letters on a page that turns into words, that turns into reading, whether that's numbers coming from the stock market that turns into trends, that turns into investing, or whether it turns into articles coming out of Wikipedia or what have you, right? This literacy is what we're talking about. And we've done studies way early, back in the 1990s and 80s, where what we do is we would test people's information literacy skills, usually high college students, because that's where all the academics were. We'd run them through an hour-long, 2-hour-long class, showing them how to get the proper and right information. And what we then test them afterwards. And what we invariably found was people's information literacy skills did not improve at all, but their perception of their skills did. They came out of these classes believing that they were now better at doing what they were doing, even though they were doing the same thing. And so, and you've seen, this is why I used to make my students do a whole video around, you need a master's degree for that. This is why librarians need a master's degree, is because it's not as simple as saying, well, if they just went to the right site, I gave the racist examples in the past, but encyclopedia or Wikipedia. Wikipedia has every problem that the Encyclopedia Britannica and the World Book and all those back in the day did. It's just, you can see it, right? The Encyclopedia Britannica was full, and it's not even published anymore, but it was full of wrong information, racist information, all this sort of information, but you couldn't see it, you couldn't edit it, you couldn't put your own voice into it, you couldn't observe it. And at least with Wikipedia, it's transparent. So I tell my students that your first stop should be Wikipedia, because what it's really, really good at is getting you started. Don't stop at Wikipedia, but it's great to get you started. And so as you begin to look at these things about, it's not a matter of here's the good information, we're saved. And what we're finding is that the same thing that's leading people to become their own doctors and see that hydrochloroquine is going to save them from COVID. And we sit there and we laugh. Yeah. Is this, and yet how many times do we go look at the Doppler radar to see if it's going to rain soon? And are we meteorologists? Right. And so, right. And there's one of the things that's being challenged in higher education in particular is, what is research? What does it mean to know this topic? What does it mean to gain expertise? And so it's not, Google is not the problem here. Google has its own problems, but Wikipedia is not the problem. It's that people feel that if I can read it on a screen through a quick search, that is sufficient to become expert in a topic. And that's where we're really wrestling with this. And we wrestle with this on the pros and cons of it. And so you end up with people like David Weinberg at Harvard, and written books called, Everything is Miscellaneous and such. And he talks about how information is commoditized. Mm-hmm. And he gives the example that they were talking about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in a meeting he was in. And he saw everyone suddenly open up their laptops and go search. And they read on Wikipedia and they continue with the conversation. And he said, look, we just feed in this packet of information. We become informed and we continue the conversation. And I said, well, that's great. As long as you know where Wikipedia is, as long as you know how to use a computer to get there, as long as you have some basic concept of copyright, as long as you have the money to be in a Harvard meeting. It's like, it's a little bit more complex than just, if I can read it off of Wikipedia, I've got it. And you bring in social justice issues, you bring in political ideologies, you bring in the nature of power. And that's why I come back to this notion of librarians being disruptors as well as constructors, because sometimes to get people on the right path, which is usually almost always socially defined, you've got to break them of what they thought was the way to go. And that people don't like to be broken. My line about, we all want to be lifelong learners, but to become a lifelong learner, you have to accept that you have been ignorant all of your life minus one day. And that can be a painful realization on a pretty regular basis.
It is, and I think we see that we're seeing it right now in the workforce. Last year was a huge disruptor, obviously. And this year, people are suddenly deciding, maybe I don't want to go back to sitting at a desk. Maybe I don't want to go back to being, in the corporate office. I was reading an article the other day where a CEO is looking to retire now in September. And he said one of the greatest lessons he got last year was that he is still in a young man's game and he needs to get out. And he said, it doesn't mean I can't run a Fortune 500 company. It doesn't mean I haven't done great things. He said, but what I learned very quickly was there was an adaptation last year of these younger people who, okay, starting tomorrow, we're staying home. Great. Where do I log in? And they moved on about their life. He said, and for me, I was like, what do you mean I can order groceries online? And he's like, and my wife's saying, well, how do we take the car to get serviced if we can't see people? And he said, we struggled adapting our lifestyle and adapting, how was I going to communicate not walking down the hallway and seeing people? How was I going to communicate an email, the same voice that I have personally with you one-on-one? And he said, and for these folks, it was nothing, and he said, so the lesson for me was I need to go do something that I'm good at in a way that I can do it and I enjoy it. He said, and coming back into the office is not something that's going to do that now because the office is forever changed. Yeah. And I'm not part of that change.
And what's interesting is, I was just reading today that there's yet another Google employee revolt because they're working on back to the office and hybrid working plans. And it just so happens that if you're a worker, you can apply to work remotely, or you can apply to go to a different campus. And if you work remotely or you work out of one of our hubs, so you move to North Carolina where they're opening up a big spot, or you move to the middle of Iowa because you can work remotely, they're going to deduct your pay. They're going to make it market relevant. In other words, this is what we
Yeah.
pay you in Idaho, not what we pay you in San Francisco. And meanwhile, a senior executive has just declared that he's moving to New Zealand. And they're like, hello, so it's okay for them. And Apple says, you're all coming back on the 25th. And meanwhile, Twitter and Reddit say, you never have to come back again. And so whole industries are doing this. In higher education, which is, my industry, we're wrestling with. We were having this talk before the recording started. David Lankes is, professor at the University of Texas at Austin, which sounds really cool. And everyone loves Austin. But then you go and look at the real estate market in Austin and you get terrified. And so I'm going to be, I might as well keep my house in South Carolina and commute for the amount of money house I can afford. And actually, then raises the question about, well, why don't I? We just did a year online education. Why not sit? Why bother going to Austin? And is there value to being there physically? Is there value? And all of this conversation is going on right now. I'm not a big fan of generations. And so, because frankly, I really hope that I live to 90, and when I'm at 90, I can be pissed off at what's going on in Twitter. But it is, that agility, it also comes at a cost. And one of the things that, talking about the roles of libraries can play and EdTech can play is the notion that we all got a little too much isolation in the past year and a half, and we're all hurt for it. We're all not okay. And how do we take advantage of that? And so we saw libraries create community spaces and ways to communicate. In Toronto, they identified 20,000 of their elderly regular population, and they picked up the phone and called them to see how they were doing. Right. And yet you look at what happened in higher education, and you look at what happened in K-12 education, which is we threw Zoom at people and said, go.
Yep.
And it wasn't a year. Now we're a year later, and the studies are going back going, do you realize what a cognitive load that is on people? Do you realize that, you can't sit in the back, you can't get distracted, that's a problem? And we didn't really look at the technology that we deployed to support the community in the way that we just sort of took for granted we were in person, right? In person, if I have a student in my class that is suffering, that uses phrases like killing themselves, et cetera, there is an 800 number I can call, and I can get a team of people immediately to respond to support that student. When that student is taking my class in New York, good luck. Really, and that can be tragic.
So we had an interesting situation here where, with the best of intentions, and we always start this with the best of intentions.
Right.
So we had elementary school district, obviously, okay, starting Monday, everybody has to be at home and all, listed on the lower income level in a school grade. So they gave every student an iPad. A corporation stepped in and said, let us pay for these, send the children home, they can learn from their iPad. And then someone figured out that because of the poverty district they live in, these people don't have Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
And so it was just like this aha moment in the community, because you're in a big bustling city and everybody's, bouncing from tower to tower here. And all of a sudden somebody went, none of these kids can do anything because the iPad doesn't connect to anything. So corporation again steps in, they pay to have hotspots put in, everything. And, but, we're talking 2 weeks into school now that kids have not had anything to do. Parents are going crazy. And so one of the companies nearby this district said, we will provide a hotspot. It's nice weather out. If you want to come over, sit in our grassy lawn area around our big, beautiful building, or come sit in our lobby with your kids, you can hop on. And so they did that. And people were going over there, and sitting out in the grass. You drive by and you see all these kids with on iPads out there. And it was really kind of, it was kind of cute, because you're like, wow, look, school's sort of in session, but they're 6 feet apart. They're all wearing masks. But, with the best of intentions, we hadn't thought the entire process through. When the libraries here said, we're going to have to close, but we recognize many of you rely on our Wi-Fi, what can we do for you? What would make this work? The libraries went at it from a different approach and said, we're here for you. So let's figure this out together. And what is it that you're going to need? Because many of you come to use our computers because we provide the Wi-Fi service. So, it was just so funny to see the total difference in how the school district approached it and how the libraries approached it. same end result. Everybody's on, everybody's getting things. But it's that value proposition that we often drop when we're looking at information. We're not thinking through everything that's needed or everything that should be provided in order for people to have the best access and the best ability to reach this. And so I look at this and I think about, and I know you and I've had this conversation before, in the terms of online teaching, we moved things over. We didn't say, let us help you design your course. Let us help you figure out how to transition your course. We just said, move your stuff over. Here's your Zoom account, party
right.
on. And what I loved was I talked with someone who has multiple children. And so she said, it is fascinating to me. Kids are spread out across the house going to school during the day. She said, and my one daughter has a teacher who shows up every day in a different costume. And everyone has to talk about what they did last night, being stuck at home. And she's like, just lots of interaction, lots of cool things. She said, and my other daughter, more PowerPoints, some animation, more things going on screen at least. She said, and my son, his teacher comes on and says, everything's in a PDF and you should go read this. And at 2:00, log back in.
Right.
She's like, talk about 3 different extremes. She said, and I never would have seen this had I not had them all home going to school. She said, so then we get into the library portion of it. She said, and my daughter has full internet access to the library, and the librarians she goes, I don't know if they're sitting there at night, like scanning things in or what, but stuff is miraculously appearing the next morning that they need. She said, the other teacher, some things are on here, some things I'm just going to send you to a website. It's not what we normally do, but, we've cleared them. They're, parental guidance kind of thing. She said, and my son's class, we're just not going to use the library this term.
Yeah. Yeah.
At all? Nope, not at all, because it's just too much work to get to it. So again, it's the value proposition of what we're thinking of and what we're doing. It's fascinating that we really haven't stepped forward and said, okay, here's how we're going to deal with this and here's how we're going to do it, unless we have that constituent of librarians that are saying to us, let us help you.
Right. And this is the classic phrase of never let a crisis go wasted. What's interesting is when libraries closed, and they said, we're still here. We're going to basically amp up the power to our Wi-Fi and invest in some more ebooks. That was their first reaction. And then they slowly began with the idea of maybe hosting book groups, there was one library in Chattanooga, Tennessee, great public library. They more or less started doing so much video programming and video enrichment that they started treating it like a television network where they would schedule things. And you had to have so much viewership in order to stay on the schedule. But what was interesting is when libraries had always, particularly public libraries, had positioned themselves as the last mile solution, that they could provide you internet access even if you couldn't get it home, you didn't have the money, you didn't have access, you didn't have a connection, what have you, come to your public library. And what's interesting is now what we found is when you take away the physical access, that solution doesn't work very well. And so libraries need to think that in their advocacy and service work, they need to go beyond the physical facility. And so that leads to things like advocating for broadband, universal broadband to the home. But that in itself is an interesting move. But what becomes much more interesting is when these folks couldn't get into the building and couldn't get their internet access, Fortune 500 companies were sending their staff home and saying, we'll be on a Zoom meeting next Thursday, see you there. And they were finding out the number of staff that they had, highly paid professional staff they had, that didn't have access. It's like, well, I live out in the middle of nowhere because I can afford to and didn't need to worry about it. And suddenly I can't get a hold of the VP of so-and-so. And university after university sent their students home and suddenly found out that, well, they had internet access. It turns out it was on their phone, and one class blows their data cap. And now it's too expensive for them to go to another class, and it's not even tuition. And so suddenly this notion of universal broadband becomes an advocacy effort that's not just within the libraries, but includes universities, includes Fortune 500 companies. It includes a whole raft of people that never knew this was a problem before. And that's the kind of opportunities that we need to take on. And that libraries, as advocating, now as we're talking about the hybrid work environment, and we're saying, we just mentioned Google and such, but you're working for Twitter, and you're pulling down a 6-figure salary and you can work from home. But honestly, the dogs are driving you nuts and you've seen these walls so many times, get me the hell out of here. Public libraries can become co-working spaces. And in fact, that's back to Chattanooga. That's one of their ways that they were part of the business community was recruiting people to telecommute to Atlanta because Atlanta's horrible. We have gigabit access and a ring around the community. Come here, get a better quality of life, more bang for your buck, and you can still be commuting to Atlanta virtually. We can do that. And now what we're seeing is that's almost every industry is having that disruption. Now, we also need to take a moment to realize that there are many jobs and many people who aren't in a position to benefit from this. They're the people who work at grocery stores. There are fast food folks. There are people that can't afford to do this and need to physically be there. And the pandemic has had an outsized negative effect on their life. And we need to look at that as a potential equalizing factor as well.
I think it's going to continue to be a conversation as we start to, go back, don't go back, figure out what we need. The other side of it is we sent everybody home. And because of cybersecurity issues, most companies had everything locked down so tight that you got home and you couldn't get in.
Right.
And so we heard a lot about that in the EdTech space as well, which was, hey, your product's not working from here. Well, it's not the product that's not working. It's the fact that, you've locked down your system and you're requiring everyone to go through a VPN or some other entry-level access point. And even dual authentication. We found some places where people dropped off because they're not sitting on 5 bars. They're sitting on 2 bars. And so they couldn't get through 2-level authentication because it would time out. So I talked to companies where, I said, have you thought of just expanding the amount of time that the second part of the authentication runs? Run your timing system to where it's a little longer. And then voila, people got in. It was fascinating because people thought I was like the guru of something. And I'm like, no, it just makes sense to me. That having lived rural once upon a time and remember the little circle rolling and rolling, it just makes sense. But, we were not thinking through holistically about any of these things. And I think, one of the things that I love about the area that you work in is librarianship is one part of it, but information science, nobody thinks about that at top of mind in terms of fields. Top of mind is always IT, it's always education, it's always those things. But talk to us a little bit about information science and how it ties into librarianship, because I think for our listeners, oftentimes they also don't understand that there's an entire field that fits so nicely into the EdTech space in terms of where they want to go and how they want to pivot and have flexibility in what they're looking at.
Yeah, because information science really is looking at, to me, it's that middle layer that fits between an organizational goal and the technology and tools to make it happen. And so it's the bridge between those two things. They need to understand management and the business processes, but they also need to have an understanding of technology and how to implement it. And they come in looking at information as an asset. And just really quickly stealing some ideas from the book, this really began to emerge as a concept during World War II, when information, in this case it was intelligence, was seen as a vital asset to the war effort and needed to be managed in and of itself. It actually even goes back to World War I, but in World War II, they weaponized the Library of Congress. They connected it with intelligence agencies. And rather than looking at human intelligence, what would become the CIA started out in the federal government and working hand in hand with the Library of Congress, where they sent analysts, they sent book buyers, they sent all these folks over to Europe to collect open source information, to, in essence, smuggle themselves into Germany and occupied areas, gather the materials and technical documents and the newspapers to find out what's going on. And they realized that if they could organize, that they would get all of this, at the time, microfilm back and have no idea what was on it, no idea how to find anything in it. And so they had to begin to organize that information. And when they were looking at how do I organize this, they moved to library science, where you organize volumes of materials. And it became this idea that information is an asset that can be managed for any organization, whether it's a government, whether it's a library, what have you. And it really then moved into methods of organizing information, methods of retrieving that information, methods of putting that information to use, strategic use of that information, assets, and eventually into how we shared it and eventually into how we secured it, all as an evolution around this idea. And so information science, it looks at how do you look at this as an asset, and then how do you organize it? How do you protect it? How do you provide access to it? What's the interface for it? And then its ethical use as well, and its societal use. And that information, which is a lovely word because it really does mean nothing. I asked 5 of my colleagues to define information, and I swear to God, I ended up with 7 different definitions. My favorite of which was I don't know and I don't care. But it, a lot of data science is growing out of information science. And how do we, once again, I talked early on about literacy, looking for patterns, identifying the patterns, and then utilizing the patterns to improve your position, whether that's position in the market, whether that's position within your class, whether that's position within the community you live in, what have you. And so information science, what we work with at the undergraduate level, we work at the graduate level, is really that idea of how do you manage this asset? And it works really, really well when you team it with other disciplines. When I was at Syracuse, all the finance majors from the business schools had a hard time finding jobs. And yet the big consulting firms and the big Wall Street firms were gobbling up information science students. And particularly they were gobbling up anyone that either had an information science minor and say a finance major, or the other way around, because they knew that they could find the banking people. They knew that they could find the business people. But increasingly, they were having to go into organizations, and it wasn't about finding their money or where their money was. It was about finding their assets and their information and being able to broadcast and forecast opportunities. And so an interesting sort of putting these 3 worlds together about information, library science, and education technology is what we see now going on when we look at the life and advancement of student success. That, at the faculty level in higher education, we have commoditized and just used information as a nasty weapon around productivity. But now, and I worry about the undergraduate level, but we look at how do you organize a class? Well, that class is only one event in a student's lifetime, in a student's life on campus. It's also where they eat and who they study with and what after school activities they do and what they use in the library. And as we can begin to gather that data in an ethical way, we can hopefully begin to identify ways to improve student performance, which is the same idea that we're trying to do in the classroom. Now, libraries are really trying to lead the way in how we do that across the discipline. So my son is going to be a freshman this year. And so we went to orientation. And I swear I began to count. He walked out of that orientation with 5 different apps, one for physical, one for the public safety, one for the learning management system, which, by the way, he couldn't actually use the app. He should go through the website, but there's an app anyway. There was one for career services and outsourcing to Handshake. And that doesn't even then include, there was a separate web portal for his medical information. And then there's another one for, it was ridiculous. What had happened is, I said, it's a perfect example of where really, a bunch of well-meaning people seeking to make people's lives better without any coordination makes it worse. And the enterprise and the education technology environment that our undergraduates are walking into is horrific, because everyone says if we just throw an app at it, it'll be better, not realizing that you end up with 5 different apps and 30 different Facebook pages and all these other portals. And the librarians have the expertise in data management. They have expertise in finding information, organizing the information, teaming that with education technologists who can really talk about the appropriate use of information and instructional design experience, and then teaming it with what we're trying to do in the classroom. It can become extraordinarily powerful as a way of truly creating a streamlined, information-rich, but well understood space for our students to succeed. And so often people leave the librarian out of that because they're like, oh yeah, and then you can go get your electronic reserve there. But it's so much more that they can be getting out of it.
Well, and I think, you're absolutely right. We have definitely been in the wave of apps. There's an app for everything. I mean, I can use an app for my toaster if I wanted to. I am perfectly capable of, pushing the button myself, but it's nice to know I can be in the other room and have toast fall into it. But, the other thing is that we're just not really looking at preparation for leaving school in terms of the workforce. And even within the workforce, we're not looking in terms of skill set and managing and helping people to grow with that. For me, I've always seen library science and information science and ed tech as a triangle. And if you do all of them and make the perfect triangle, your career opportunities are boundless, whether that's working in intelligence in the federal government, if that's working as an ed tech startup, if that's working as, a business owner, working in Fortune 500, because what we're seeing now is that the skill set has to go across the board. You have to come in with more than just a major and just knowledge in one subject area. You're being required to cover a lot of different issues and situations. Last year was a perfect example. Suddenly you're managing a team that sits in Germany or sits in China, who's in a different time zone, who maybe has more than one language they're using, who has their own set of apps that are different than what corporate headquarters is using for their apps, because they're trying to buy local in the sense of using what people are used to where they live. As we work remotely, we're going to see more of that too. Oh, well, we don't use this here. If you think back in the day when cell phones really took off, you remember that they used to sell cell phone services by region. Mm-hmm. So you were T-Mobile if you lived in the West Coast, but you were Cellular One if you lived in the Midwest, and you were, Verizon, which was just starting, if you were on the East Coast. And heaven forbid you decided to travel because you had to sign up and pay extra and hopefully, know that it bounced and such. That's kind of where we're at with apps now. It's repetitive in the sense of, oh, well, if you're in China, they use, 2 or 3 different what we call Zoom equivalents. And so now, obviously, that's a problem, because how do we get them on Zoom if they don't have access to it? And some of those things are starting to work out after last year, but it's still going to be a long ways away. So it kind of reminds me of the title of your book, Forging the War. The war is still going. I think we're in like phase 12 of the war now. If you take all the layers away, the war is still the same, which is accessibility, sharing of information, bringing the right people to the table to have the right discussions and to look at where we're going with it. And we always take 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards in these processes. So, tell me a little bit about, as we wrap up today, a little bit about your book and where it's available from, what its impact is now as we're moving forward.
Well, so it's Forged in War, and it's available on Amazon and everywhere you buy your books. And it's Kindle, and you can even hear someone, not me, but with a much deeper voice, read it as an ebook on Audible. And so it's available there. And it really does. Actually, it's a great example you gave, because cellular technology grew out of what were called at the time baby bells, which were regional telecom operators. And regional telecom operators came out of the regulatory breakup of AT&T, which was Ma Bell. And what's interesting is, if you go back further, AT&T, which began as a telegraphy service, grew out of attempts to create telegraphs and share it. And at one time, they were separate networks as well. So if you bought your telegraph network and radio network from Marconi, you couldn't pass it to the next person if they didn't have the same service, et cetera. And it took the lead up to World War I, and the Navy more or less creating something called common carrier rules, which says, I don't care who owns the technology, you've got to pass it to the different network, right? That led to this notion of interoperability. Well, what the book's about is to understand why we're in this crazy situation now. It's not because we chose to be in a crazy situation. It's because people made decisions throughout history that they thought were good at the time. And it's sort of like what I said about my kids' undergraduate orientation. A lot of people seeking the common good, but without coordination, leads to a lot of disruption, a lot of duplication. And so the book itself looks at major technologies, the invention of massive scale computing, the invention of massive ubiquitous networking, which came out of the Cold War attempts to create a robust telephone network, which turned into what we know as the internet today. The modern media landscape, which came out of deregulation and came out of the advent of cable as a technology, and et cetera. And so it tries to address what the central concept is, something called the knowledge infrastructure. That is, the mechanisms by which we learn. And when I say learn, people instantly think in a class, but I just mean literally about the world, our place in it. And that includes your buddies, your friends, your Facebook friends, as well as libraries, as well as what you find on Google, and that it's been around forever. The pharaohs, it was in hieroglyphics and such, but that right now it's out of whack and it needs some serious rethinking about how we balance the need of the common good versus commercial needs, how we balance information and disinformation, that it is ultimately socially constructed. And so we have to pay attention to issues like diversity, not just because we say so, but because the best learning comes from the richest information available. And we need diversity to make sure that we add that best information. Copyright, that one of the things that we found that when libraries shut down for COVID, they went online, they started doing story time and reading books to kids, which was helpful for the Fortune 500 companies because it meant that their kids could be occupied while their parents were trying to do work, and we were violating copyright to do it. And we need to talk about exceptions, et cetera. So it really is an attempt to say, look, we're in a really interesting spot where your television watches you, and we sell refrigerators with screens in them for less than it costs us to build them because we're going to sell the data on that, your egg supply, to make up the difference. All right, how the hell did we get there? And how does that go back to the penny press? And how does that go back into different business models and surveillance technologies and all this kinds of things? And so I promise it only gets tinfoil hattish in a few parts. Mostly it is meant as a very accessible and practical way to sort of talk about this issue so that we don't look at it as all brand new, that we don't have any thinking about, and we don't look at them as a series of isolated issues. They really are connected with how we get smarter as a society.
Well, and I do want to say to our listeners, if you're an investor, if you're in a startup, you're thinking about a startup, you're thinking of designing an app, it's a great book to read, because all of you, when I talk with people in these fields, one of the first questions you ask is, what's the history of this? Why is this going this way? When I talk with investors, it's always fascinating to me that they will say, well, do you think this will go forward? And why are they choosing to do this? And why are they choosing to do it now? Well, all of this has a historical perspective to it. And I mean historical, not as in the last year, this seemed like a great idea. You have to know where we came from to know where we're going. It's never changed, no matter how much we try to say, oh, we'll just forget the past and we'll move forward. It doesn't happen. It doesn't work well. So, David, I so appreciate you being on today. You and I could have like a whole day's worth of conversation on so many topics. So thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. Everyone that's listening, as he said, his book is available on Amazon and also on Kindle Audio. Again, that is Forged in War: How a Century of War Created Today's Information Society. Also know that he is available, and we'll put the website and his Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn information up as well on our site. For those of you that listen on Spotify or Google or Apple or any of the other locations that you enjoy getting us, you'll see his information there. You're also welcome to follow us on Instagram and Twitter. We hope you've really enjoyed today's episode at EdTech Speaks and can make use of the information we've given you. We've tried to take you out of your comfort zone into a historical perspective and to start to understand where real information lives and where you can start to really seek out help in navigation and in moving your business forward and in your education as well. Find out more about us on www.downingedtech.com. And until next time, keep learning.
Thank you for listening to EdTech Speaks with EdTech strategist Cher Downing. To learn more about the services Downing EdTech and its staff can provide you, find us at www.downingedtech.com. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to share it. We'd also like to hear from you regarding any suggestions for topics or guests and the value you received from our show. Check back for new podcasts with featured guests at www.downingedtech.com/podcast.